Right, well, good evening, everybody. Can you hear me at the back okay? Good. So, we're going to consider Jerusalem and the coming conflict that's going to be centered on Jerusalem, and the fact that Jerusalem is going to be the epicenter of World War III. When I was growing up, I grew up as a Christadelphian, and I remember being the sort of age of Toby, the sort of age of Ben, not very old. And I remember during the 70s listening to talks about Jerusalem. I was probably 8, 9, 10. I can remember some of the talks. And the speaker used to stand up and say, Jerusalem is going to become the center of Armageddon. There's going to be a great conflict centered on Jerusalem. And at that sort of time, Jesus is going to come back. And I can't think of how many talks I've heard over the decades that have got that message into my mind straight out of the Bible. But here we are right now, after all this time that's gone by, and suddenly, I think you might agree with me, that all of a sudden Jerusalem definitely is headline news, is it not, around the world following President Trump's announcement around about a week and a half ago. And momentous things could well be about to happen, because the status quo that has been in planet Earth in relation to Jerusalem has suddenly and overnight been broken. And I'm going to explain to you exactly what has been broken and why this could start fulfilling some of the passages that we've just been reading just now. But just to remind you as to what President Trump said, I'm going to play some of his speech. It lasted 11 and a half minutes. I can't play you the whole speech, but there's around about 2.5 minutes which gets the key points across. Here's what President Trump said on the 6th of December.
I have determined that it is time to officially recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. While previous presidents have made this a major campaign promise, they failed to deliver. Today, I am delivering. I've judged this course of action to be in the best interests of the United States of America and the pursuit of peace between Israel and the Palestinians. This is a long overdue step to advance the peace process and to work towards a lasting agreement. Israel is a sovereign nation with the right, like every other sovereign nation, to determine its own capital. Acknowledging this is a fact is a necessary condition for achieving peace. It was 70 years ago that the United States under President Truman recognized the state of Israel. Ever since then, Israel has made its capital in the city of Jerusalem, the capital the Jewish people established in ancient times.
So this is quite a momentous thing for somebody to say, and I think by the time I've finished, you'll see just how momentous this is. But clearly, a statement about Jerusalem is going to potentially wind up a whole bunch of people who are very interested in Jerusalem from a religious point of view. One of the headlines just a couple of days ago, this is in the Daily Express, was World War III. Will World War III break out over Donald Trump's Israel-Jerusalem decision? Now you can imagine, I think back to the 70s and 80s as I was a kid growing up listening to talks. They didn't put a headline like that on the screen, did they? Well, there weren't screens back then. It was OHPs, wasn't it, and things like that. But nobody put a headline like that on the screen when I was growing up. And now here we are with a headline saying, is World War III about to break out over a decision about Jerusalem? If that doesn't make us stop in our tracks and at least sit up and think, what is happening here? What else can we view with Bible in hand that gets us motivated to think what is happening in relation to Jerusalem? Just a couple of days ago, it was, I think, last Monday, last Tuesday perhaps, the Prime Minister of Turkey convened an emergency Arab summit, and every single solitary Arab nation attended Istanbul. And in fact, the picture's a lot wider than that, because every single Muslim nation attended. There were 57 heads of Arab Muslim nations. And at this emergency summit, quite unusually actually for these types of summits, they actually had an agreement at the end of it, because normally there's division. But not at this one. And what they said was at the end of this particular summit that happened this last week, was that Eastern Jerusalem needs to be declared the Palestinian capital of a future Palestinian state. They also said that the world should renounce and annul President Trump's announcement. They also went on and said that from here on in, America has absolutely no role to play in the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians, and all 57 nations agreed to that. That was on Tuesday, and on the back of President Trump's announcement. So quite clearly, there's already a huge amount that has stirred up on the back of President Trump's announcement, and Turkey, President Erdogan, I should say, is leading the charge on this, calling Israel a terrorist state, and so on. So a whole bunch of things have now kicked off, and we need to have a look and see what the Bible says about this. Just before we do, just to give you a little bit of background about Jerusalem, because we say, well, look, Jerusalem's a city, it's a long way from here. Why is everybody so concerned about Jerusalem? Surely, you know, there's many, many hundreds of capital cities in the world. Why would everybody get so stirred up about this city in a land far away from most people? I think the answer to that is on the screen. It is that, without any shadow of a doubt, the most religious city on earth. And what I want to do is just show you this map here. This is a map of the old city of Jerusalem. Now, originally, of course, Jerusalem was quite small. In fact, this is, you can see like this orange line that comes around. This is the wall that went around the old city of Jerusalem. And over time, Jerusalem's grown and grown like cities do, and it's way past those walls now. But this is the original old city of Jerusalem. And on the right-hand side here, this is where the Dome of the Rock is. So you know the gold dome that you see on pictures of Jerusalem? That's here on this eastern side here. But you notice it's colour-coded. So this top left is in blue, then we've got another colour here, a yellowy colour, and then we've got another colour down here. And what's happening is, Jerusalem is split into quarters. The old city of Jerusalem is split into quarters. So you've got a Christian quarter here, you've got a Muslim quarter here, you've got the Jewish quarter here, and you've got the Armenian quarter here. Now, what the reason for this is because all of these different peoples have got a claim on Jerusalem. It's almost just got divided up into four, because those four different types of people have got a claim on Jerusalem. The Jewish quarter that's down here have got a claim on Jerusalem from a religious point of view, because they say, quite rightly so, that the ancient temples of God were built right where the Dome of the Rock is right now. The temple built by King Solomon, and also another temple that got built on the same site, were all there. And in the temple, of course, there was religious worship and worship of God. So they say, look, thousands of years ago, around about 3,000 years ago, Jerusalem was our centre of religious worship. The Muslims say, well, actually, it's our third most holy site. Mecca, I think, is number 1, but Jerusalem's number 3. And Muhammad went to Jerusalem and took off on a winged horse from Jerusalem, and therefore it is special to us. The Christians say, well, actually, Jerusalem is special to us, Because Jesus was crucified at Jerusalem, and the first church was established in Jerusalem, and then it spread out from there. The Armenian quarter, the UN deemed that to be the Palestinian quarter, and they also have very similar understanding to the Muslims over here. But here's the thing. The amount of people that are involved behind the scenes on these religions is enormous. Does anybody know roughly how many Muslims there are in the world right now? The answer is 1.5 billion Muslims. You've got, give or take, roughly 1 billion Christians. So you've now got 2.5 billion people that have got some relationship with this city. And how many Jews, by the way, do you think there are on the earth right now?
500 million?
500 million. Do you know what the answer is? About 15 million, between 15 and 20 million. Which is tiny, isn't it, in comparison to the others? We're talking billions versus a few million. So tiny percentage of Jews in the world. There's no other city on planet Earth that's got anything like this going on, where there's all the religions that have got something to say about this particular city. But look, this is just from a religious point of view. Because on the other side of the coin, there's this. There are two races of people that not only say this is our religious city, they say it's our political city, it's our capital city. So that man there is Mahmoud Abbas, and he runs the Palestinians, if you like. He's the leader of the Palestinians. And as you can see there, he says East Jerusalem is going to be, or should be, the capital city of our future state. That's nothing to do with religion, that's just politics. That's saying it's our political capital. Israel says, putting religion on one side, this should be our capital. But they say it's not East Jerusalem, it's the eternal, indivisible capital. The whole of Jerusalem should be our capital city. So what we've got now is the religions all looking at it, and we've got two races of people saying, from a political point of view, this is ours. Now this is a right mess, isn't it? When you look at it, there's so much emotion, there is so much going on, there's so much division all over this one city there in the middle of Israel. And what we're going to do tonight is have a look at what the Bible says about Jerusalem, and we're going to have a look at why all of these things are starting to happen now, or have begun to happen now, in relation to Trump's speech, and the significance of the timing of all of this. So we're going to go to the Bible. By the way, this is not a history lesson on Jerusalem from the beginning. I've got talks on that on the internet if you wanted to look at that. So we're not going all the way back to the very beginning of how Jerusalem was established. Most of what we're doing is modern day history of what's going on. But we're going to go to the Bible and look at some verses that talk about the conflict that is fast approaching right now. One interesting fact is that Jerusalem is mentioned more than 700 times in your Bible on your lap right now. 700 times. That's the word Jerusalem is mentioned more than 700 times. In the Quran, how many times is Jerusalem mentioned? Tony's got the right answer. None. It isn't mentioned a single solitary time. And you might say, well, maybe they call it a different name, which they do. They call it Al-Quds. How many times is Al-Quds mentioned in the whole of the Quran? The answer is 0. It's not mentioned once, which is quite interesting, isn't it? The Bible has got 700 plus times it's mentioned, and that isn't including other names, like the name of Zion, for instance. And when you add up all the names, the biblical names for Jerusalem, you start approaching 1,000 times that it is mentioned. And that is, of course, because the Bible is totally centred and focused upon this city. It is where Jesus one day is going to rule from as king over the entire world. The Bible's got a lot to say about Jerusalem. Now, have you got your Bibles open at Zechariah 12 still? Good. So keep them open there, but I'm going to put some words on the screen. Now look, some of you here will have read these words hundreds, thousands of times. But I think I'm going to show you something here that you might not have probably stopped and thought about. Maybe you have. But I'm going to show you some interesting things with just the first two verses. So here we have, I think this is from the New King James Version, but it works in any version. Zechariah chapter 12 verse 2 says, "Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling unto all the people round about, when they shall be in the siege both against Judah and against Jerusalem. And in that day will I make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all people. All that burden themselves with it shall be cut in pieces, though all the people of the earth be gathered together against it." So do you notice that there are two descriptions of what Jerusalem is going to become at some point in time? The first description, it says there, is Jerusalem is going to become a cup of trembling. Now, Graham, you did not read the word trembling. You read a different word. What did you read in verse 2? It was a cup of drunkenness. Now, the reason that your version has translated it drunkenness is because the word trembling literally means to be reeling from drink. So you know when you see somebody walking down the road and they're sort of doing this? That is really, it's not trembling as in fear, it is actual reeling as in drunkenness. So lots of modern translations will translate it as drunkenness, and it does mean that you're reeling. So this is some people, and we'll look at who they are in just a second, but Jerusalem is this cup of drunkenness. Now, what tends to happen, I ask you, when people have too much to drink? What are some of the consequences of drinking too much? Apart from just reeling around, what else might you see on the street? Imagine the streets at night, people have had too much to drink. What might happen on those streets? Violence. People do things that they would never have done before, wouldn't they? With too much drink, you get people fighting and punching, and the same person the next day who's sober can't believe that that's what he's done. And Jerusalem, to a group of people, it's as if it's got them drunk, and clearly they are, doing crazy things that they wouldn't normally have done, and it's almost as if they are drunk, and there's almost certainly violence involved when people are drunk to that extent. But it's also described as a burdensome stone. And a burdensome stone literally means it's a bit like Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a great big heavy stone, and they're trying to move it. I think your version, Graham, said something like that they were trying to move it, did it?
A very heavy stone for all peoples.
Yeah, and they're sort of trying to do something with it. They're trying to, there's Jerusalem, imagine it's a big stone, it's ever so heavy, we're trying to move it from one place, we're trying to do something with it. We're trying to change it, we're trying to move it around. And what happens to the people who try and move it around? They're cut into pieces, which isn't too great, is it? Jerusalem brings their destruction. Now watch the screen here, because there's two definitions of what happens to Jerusalem. One is that it sends people loopy and crazy as if they're drunk, and the other is that it's like a big heavy thing that I'm trying to move. But watch this. It happens to different types of people. You see, here, look, is Jerusalem a couple of trembling, but it's unto a specific group of people, which are people that are round about. And that in the original Hebrew means nearby. In fact, a lot of modern translations say surrounding peoples or nearby peoples. So the people who live nearby go crazy and mad, but they're nearby. But this one here where it says, I'll make Jerusalem a burdensome stone, isn't, you notice, for people round about. It is for all people. So there's a group of people that are nearby that get impacted, and they go completely crazy. The other people, which is the rest of people you would imagine that are further afield, they're not going crazy. It hasn't affected them in a drunkenness manner. They are just trying to solve a problem with this, and it's like a great big heavy burden that I'm trying to move. They haven't got the same passion Nowhere near the same passion as the people that live round about, but these people are still trying to solve it. So the way I see this is that what we've got here, here's a map, here's Israel down here, Jerusalem's in the middle, and these nearby nations, the surrounding immediate nations, those that are close by, it affects them as if they've gone completely mad, completely drunk, completely crazy, completely violent. The rest of the nations, all nations, well, they're trying to move it like some great big heavy stone. They haven't got the same passion, but they are still trying to do something with it, and this great big stone dashes them to pieces. They get nowhere with Jerusalem. When you carry on, this is a whole study just to look at this one chapter to show that it works like this, but in Zechariah chapter 12, it continues then to talk, first of all, about the surrounding people. So verse 1 and 2 is setting the scene about the nearby nations and then the wider story, and then it starts by telling us exactly what happens to these neighbouring peoples that surround. Now have a look at this. In verse 6 it says, "On that day I will make the clans of Judah," they're the people living in Israel, "like a flame that sets a woodpile ablaze, or like a burning torch among the sheaves of grain." And look what the Jews are going to do. "They will burn up all the neighbouring nations right and left, while the people living in Jerusalem remain secure." This is the New Living Translation. It's a very accurate translation, slightly better than the Authorised Version that most of us read. So look here, these are the nearby peoples who are burned up when they come and lay siege to Jerusalem, and Jerusalem remains secure. This is what I call the initial inner ring war that is surrounding peoples around Jerusalem. These are the people that go crazy. These are the people that are beating their chests. These are the people that are running around with swords. These are the people that are throwing rocks. These are the people that are going completely mental over it. You won't see that happen with people like Theresa May. She isn't going to beat her chest and start ripping things and going crazy. That won't happen. But is she going to try, along with other nations, to try and move this stone at some point? Yes. Now, Zechariah 14 talks about the wider situation when all nations eventually get involved. And it says here that I will gather all the nations to fight against Jerusalem. So there's an inner ring war that happens that Israel win. And then we move into Zechariah 14. It says all nations are going to come against Jerusalem. Now look at what happens to Jerusalem this time. Oh, no, it doesn't remain secure this time. This time, look what it says. The city will be taken, the houses looted, the women raped, half the population is taken into captivity, and the rest will be left among the ruins of the city. Now this is a major, major defeat of Jerusalem at this point. Inner ring war, they win. The second one, which pushes out into the wider nations, they seriously lose. Now what I'm going to do is show you some video here. So I'm going to show you some video that's the reaction of a nation that is right bordered up against Israel. I'm going to show you the reaction of Jordan. Have a look at this.
How concerned, sir, are you that things in Amman will get worse?
Good morning, Becky. Definitely dangerous, alarming times across the region, across the Arab Muslim world. We're extremely concerned about the consequences of this dangerous decision, not just in Jordan, across the Arab Muslim world. No issue is more sensitive to Arabs and Muslims and Christians than Jerusalem. No issue is more potent in terms of its ability to rally public opinion. So people are angry, people are outraged. We're all disappointed with this decision. Again, the consequences are going to be extremely difficult for all of us. And not just in Jordan, everybody in the Arab, Muslim, Christians, Muslims, everywhere.
So there's somebody very close to Israel saying this is going to have wide-reaching consequences. President Trump's decision. We'll look more about what he said. That's winding everybody up in a few minutes. Here is a wider view. So we're now going to look at what people are saying further afield. And we could have played this for an hour or more, but I'm just going to play a few minutes of a few key speeches.
Haberlerle ilgili üzüntülerimi bir kez daha ifade etmek istiyorum. Kudüs, Sayın Trump, Müslümanların kırmızı çizgisidir.
Rivolgere un accorato appello affinché sia impegno di tutti a rispettare lo status quo della città in conformità con le pertinenti risoluzioni delle Nazioni Unite.
By announcing that he's declaring war in the Middle East. He's declaring war against 1.5 billion Muslims, hundreds of millions of Christians.
I have consistently spoken out against any unilateral measures that would jeopardize the prospect of peace for Israelis and Palestinians. Jerusalem is a final status issue that must be resolved through direct negotiations between the two parties on the basis of the relevant Security Council and General Assembly resolutions, taking into account the legitimate concerns of both the Palestinian and the Israeli.
So you can see the sort of rhetoric that's coming out. I could have played you clips from China, from even North Korea. Everybody has had something to say following President Trump's announcement of declaring that Israel and that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel and his intention to move the embassy there. What I want to spend a few minutes now doing is explaining to you why now is so significant from a time point of view. It is utterly no coincidence that these things are happening now, and I want to try and show you why it is happening now. And to understand why it's happening now, what we have to do is to look at the brief history of the recreation of Israel on planet Earth. And once you start doing that, you understand why now things are starting to move. And we've got to go back to 1897. And in 1897, there was the very first Zionist Congress in Switzerland, headed up by Theodor Herzl, that you can see on the screen there. Now, what this conference was about we need to establish a nation for the Jews somewhere on earth, and preferably in Palestine, because of course that's what Israel was called before it has now become Israel. So we want a homeland for the Jewish people. Why hadn't the Jews got a homeland at this point? When did the nation of Israel cease to exist before? AD 70. So nearly 2 millennia before, Israel ceased to exist when the Romans came down and scattered the people. And 2 millennia later, roughly, in 1897, this man convenes a Zionist conference to say, look, we need to bring the Jewish people into their own land. They need their own state. And it's a whole story as to why this suddenly happened at this point. But it did happen, and it happened in 1897. The next thing that happened, the next significant thing that happened, was in 1917. And in fact, Theresa May, the UK Prime Minister, was talking about this only the other day. And that was this. In 1917, Lord Balfour, who was effectively the foreign minister and a cabinet minister back at that time, wrote a letter to Lord Rothschild, who was then the head of the Zionist movement. And in that letter, Lord Balfour said, I've got pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, our desire to allow the Jews to have a homeland in the land of Palestine, and we will do all that we can to make that come about. Now you might say, well, who cares really what Britain says? We're a tiny little nation. Is it really that significant? But somebody tell me, what was Britain in 1917? An empire. A third of the world's landmass came under our empire at that point. In fact, in 1917, it was pretty much the peak of the British Empire. We were not only a superpower, we were superpower. 2/3 of the world's population came under the British Empire. So when we said something, or when Britain said something, everybody sat up and listened. And so when Britain as an empire said, we view with favour the establishment of a nation in Palestine for the Jews, everybody sat up and took notice. So that was in 1917. In fact, it was in November of 1917, which is why we had the 100th anniversary of that just a few weeks ago, and there were lots of articles in the daily press about it, on the news about it. Prime Minister talked about it because the 100th anniversary was significant. The Palestinians said, this is a catastrophe. You know, yes, it is the anniversary, but it was the worst bit of paper that Britain's ever written. Because, of course, it meant that Israel eventually did become a nation. The next part of the story is in 1947. Now, this is very significant. Because on the 29th of November in 1947, the United Nations, which had just been established, took a vote on approving a homeland for the Jews in Israel. And it was called the Partition Plan. And what they said was, here's Palestine, and we're going to give Israel a tiny little slither here of land for them to live in. And the vote passed in the United Nations on the 29th of November, 1947. But Jerusalem was mentioned at exactly the same point. Does anybody know what the UN resolution said in 1947 about Jerusalem? Exactly. They said Jerusalem has to be, and it will be, an international city. It's not part of Palestine. It's not part of newly created Israel. It's an international city. And the interesting thing is, from that day onwards, not one single solitary nation on earth has ever wavered from that, from an official point of view, apart from Israel themselves, who did declare it as their capital. Not one nation has changed their mind on that until Donald Trump changed his mind on behalf of America on the 6th of December.
October 1947. 2 shiploads of Jewish refugees from Europe attempt to land in Palestine, only to be turned away by the British and shipped to internment on Cyprus. The British mandate in Palestine was about to end, however, and the United Nations was debating the partition of Palestine between the Jews and the Arabs as a solution to the turmoil in that country. In May of 1948, a new Jewish state, Israel, was born in a bath of blood. Jewish troops routed Arab forces from the city of Haifa in the first of a series of battles that were to reverberate through the years. Meanwhile, on May 14th, 1948, the new government headed by David Ben-Gurion is installed in Tel Aviv. Thus, for the first time since the Roman legion destroyed Jerusalem in the year 70 AD, the Jewish people have a nation of their own.
The next significant thing that took place was this. It's 1967 now, and in 1967 there was something called the Six-Day War, which Israel won conclusively. And what it did, instead of having this little strip of land that the United Nations gave it, originally it now burst forth and not only took over lots of land, it also took over the whole of Jerusalem at that point and declared it within days to be the eternal capital of the Israeli state. So this was, again, hugely significant. Let's just have a little watch of what was going on at that time.
On the 15th of May, 1967, on Israel's Independence Day, a 3-week period began, which was one of the most tense and fearful periods in Israel's history. In direct contravention of international agreements, Egyptian leader Jamal Abdel Nasser removed the UN peacekeeping forces and began moving tens of thousands of soldiers and hundreds of tanks into what was the demilitarized Sinai Peninsula towards Israel's southern border. Egypt also blockaded the Straits of Tiran, an open international waterway which was essentially a declaration of war. Israel turned to the nations of the world, primarily to the United States, for assistance against Egyptian aggression, but somehow all Western countries decided to remain neutral. Israel, with 2.5 million Jews, was left alone to face the might of the Arab nations. Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and Lebanon formed a military alliance and began moving forces into Jordan towards Israel's borders. When the Arab countries realized that the world had abandoned Israel, many other Muslim countries were openly calling for the destruction of Israel. The will and means to murder millions of Jews were evident.
A biblical prophecy comes to pass as the forces of Israel sweep on in an astonishing triumph of strategy. After achieving air supremacy, her forces thrust like an avenging sword at the very heart of Arab self-confidence.
And then, perhaps, the greatest miracle of all, a miracle Israel never expected: Jerusalem. Again, it seemed as though it was a divine appointment in time. Jerusalem was to be restored to the Jewish people. After 2,000 years, Yitzhak Rabin, then the Minister of Defense, was given the honor of giving the war its name. He chose the Six-Day War, recalling the 6 days of creation, as Israel too was created with the liberation of Jerusalem.
These are pretty amazing events, but did you hear it then? It was like there was an appointment in time. It was a specific time that these things were happening. So we move on and we come to 1977, and in 1977 began the peace talk process between Israel and the surrounding Arab nations. So Egypt and Israel signed formal agreements, and with Jordan as well. So there was this time of peace in 1977, and when I say peace, clearly things have juddered along. You can't call it very peaceful, but there's been this time when Israel has been trying to make peace with the surrounding nations. Now, when you put all of this together, what you end up with is something that looks rather like this. So, in 1897, as we've already said, this is when the First Zionist Congress began, and 120 years later brings us to exactly where we are right now in 2017. In 1917, there was the Balfour Declaration at the next significant milestone, and we've just been celebrating that in this country, or remembering, as I should say, because that was exactly 100 years ago. In 1947, there was this UN vote on Israel that then was to say, yes, we are, as a world body, happy for Israel to be established in the land of Palestine. That was exactly 70 years ago. In 1967 was the Six-Day War, and that is when Israel, for the first time in 1,897 years, took Jerusalem and made it its capital. And in 1977, 40 years ago exactly, the peace talks began, and that brings us up to date. Now, the reason I show you all of these time periods is because every single one of them is mentioned in the Bible, and every single one of them is very, very significant from God's point of view. So I'm just going to run through these. You could do studies on these for hours on each one, but here we are very, very quickly showing you the significance of these things. 120 years is specifically mentioned in relation to Noah and the coming judgment on the earth that happened all those thousands of years ago, when God judged the world and flooded it. And a time frame was given and recorded for us in Genesis chapter 6, verse 3, of 120 years. That's the time period from when currently we've got from the beginning, if you like, of Israel being created with Theodore Herzl. 100 years is actually the very first mention of 100 years in relation to it being a generation, and that is in Genesis chapter 15. So when we read passages about things happening within a generation, the first mention of a generation is in relation to 100 years. 70 years is mentioned quite a lot in the Bible in relation to specific time periods in relation to Israel, when at the end of the 70 years something significant happened. And I'm going to show you more about that in just a second. 50 years is a highly significant number in Israel. It's a number connected with the Jubilee period, and at the end of 50 years, at the end of the Jubilee period, then effectively all debts were forgiven and a new time began. So it was all the start of a brand new time period. And 40 years in the Bible, can anybody think of a time in the Bible when 40 years is mentioned? Yeah? Yeah, exactly. When they were in the wilderness, that was a period of 40 years. And it's a time of testing. So 40 is always to do with a time of testing, and at the end of that there's some sort of judgment. So all of these are quite significant time frames, and I haven't just picked out random things here. Martin Gilbert, who has written many books on, he's not a Christadelphian, he's written many books on Israel, and he has gone through, without 2017 being mentioned, but has gone through all of these dates that I've shown you and said these are the key milestones in Israel's history. Very significant. Now, what I want to do now is replay you a little bit of what Donald Trump said in his speech. So just have another listen to this.
I have determined that it is time to officially recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. It was 70 years ago that the United States, under President Truman, recognized the state of Israel. Ever since then, Israel has made its capital in the city of Jerusalem, the capital the Jewish people established in ancient times.
Did you hear what he said? It is time. It is, well, what time? Why is it suddenly time? And I'll show you why it is time. I'm not saying Donald Trump understands why it's time, but it's interesting that he says it is time. And 70 years ago, he says, President Truman signed in, amongst all the other nations, the fact that Israel could be created as a nation on this earth. But at that time, do you remember I said, what was Jerusalem 70 years ago when the partition plan, Jerusalem was international. And for 70 long years, Jerusalem has not changed its status with one single solitary nation on earth, apart from Israel that says, hey, it's now our capital. Everybody has gone along with it. Every single nation has gone along with the fact that it's an international city until the 6th of December 2017, when for the first time out of all nations, Trump goes on TV and makes an announcement saying, I say it's time to change it. Now, when was that then? So this was on the 29th, so let me go back. So on the 29th of November 1947 was when the first vote about Jerusalem was ever taken by this world. There was never a vote before about Jerusalem, ever. This is the first vote in relation to Jerusalem with all nations on earth, and they said Jerusalem has got to be international. And that was on the 17th of Kislev. Now that is the Jewish day and the Jewish month when that announcement was made, on the 17th of Kislev, because the Jews do not run on our calendar. They don't run on Pope Gregory's calendar as we do. They run on God's calendar, the Hebrew calendar. So the 29th of December 1947 on their calendar was the 17th of Kislev. On the 6th of December 2017, Trump makes an announcement exactly 70 years later, becoming the first nation ever to officially recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. And the date he did that was the 18th of Kislev. It's the brand new 70-year period that is now beginning, which is why he mentioned the 70 years in his speech. And for the last few minutes, I'm going to show you a very interesting prophecy that maybe you haven't looked at much before, that talks, I believe, exactly about what we're witnessing right now. In Zechariah chapter 1, there's a prophecy that I think some of us will know quite well. And we've always applied it to ancient history and Babylon and a 70-year period then. But when you read it carefully, there is undoubtedly a latter-day fulfillment to this prophecy, which we're going to look at quickly here. So in Zechariah 1, verse 11 and 12, it talks about some angelic beings that have patrolled the earth, and they report in saying that the whole earth is at peace. And the angel of the Lord said, Lord Almighty, how long will you withhold mercy from Jerusalem and from the towns of Judah, which you have been angry with for these 70 years? So there's a 70-year period, and during this 70 years, the whole earth has been at peace. And then we read in verse 13 these words. Then the angel who was speaking to me said, proclaim this word. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I am very jealous for Jerusalem and Zion. I am very angry with the nations that feel secure. I was only a little angry, but they went too far with the punishment. Therefore, this is what the Lord says. I will return to Jerusalem with mercy, and there my house will be rebuilt, and the measuring line will be stretched out over Jerusalem, declares the Lord Almighty. So at this end of this 70-year period, when everything's been at peace, God says, I'm jealous now for Jerusalem, and actually I'm very angry with the nations, because I'm angry with them because they went too far with punishment on my people 70 years ago. We then read at the very end of Zechariah chapter 1 something quite strange, because it says, the Lord showed me 4 blacksmiths. Now these aren't real blacksmiths, right? There isn't real 4 men that are dressed as blacksmiths. This is symbolic. But the Lord showed me 4 blacksmiths. And what are these men coming to do, I asked. And the angel replied, these 4 horns, these nations, scattered and humbled Judah. Now these blacksmiths have come to terrify those nations and throw them down and destroy them. So the blacksmiths effectively is God's judgment coming on the nations who had punished Israel too much 70 years before. So when you look at it, there's 3 key stages to Zechariah chapter 1, which were fulfilled to some extent in the days of Babylon, but not fully. But I believe they will be fulfilled fully in what we're seeing happen now. What you've got are 3 stages. First of all, the Jews are severely persecuted, and they're persecuted more than God wanted them to be persecuted. They were persecuted beyond measure. Then a 70-year gap goes by, and the angels look round and say, the world has been at peace for 70 years. And then at the end of 70 years, God says, right, now I'm going to do something. I'm actually going to put a measuring line over Jerusalem. I'm now going to focus in on Jerusalem. I'm going to judge the nations, and I'm going to ultimately rebuild my temple in Jerusalem. That's exactly what it says. Can anybody think a while ago when the Jews might have been persecuted more than God would have wanted them to be persecuted? Does that ring any bells? The Holocaust. Now, interestingly, you don't get much more horrific in terms of nations persecuting God's people than the Holocaust. 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. This was a terrifying and awful ordeal for the Jews, and all of this finished in May 1945. That's when the Holocaust came to an end. Then, of course, just very shortly after that, the United Nations was established. Literally, at that point in time, the United Nations was sprung into being. And then, just as we've already said, in 1947, in the November, all the world's nations took a vote on Israel and a vote on Jerusalem. And they said Jerusalem is not part of Israel. Jerusalem has to be international. But we have lived through a long time of peace, have we not? I know there's been wars and Iraq wars and things like that, but there's not been a world war. And in fact, to celebrate the fact that there has not been a world war for such a long time, a couple of years ago, there was this coin that was produced, 70 years of peace, 1945 to 2015. The nations, on the whole, have not fought a major world war. There has been peace on this earth. What did it say in Zechariah 1? The angels looked and all they saw, that the world was secure, the world was at peace. And suddenly, On the very day that the 70 years was up, the very day the 70 years is up, this man comes on the scene and, as this newspaper said, has lit a fuse because he's changed the status of Jerusalem. And he said it actually is the capital of Israel. I'm forgetting about it being an international city. In fact, though, what President Trump has done is upset everybody in his statement. Because on the one hand he says, actually, Jerusalem is Israel's capital. He doesn't actually say which part of it, he just says Jerusalem. But then he also says, the Temple Mount area should still be only an area for Muslims, and they need to pray at that. Oh, and by the way, the Western Wall should actually be the Jews in any future settlement. And by the way, clearly there's got to be a future settlement, and the whole city might actually end up being divided. So in one statement, he's managed to upset every single solitary person that's anything to do with it. Absolutely everybody. So I believe he has lit a fuse. I think the timing is absolutely the right timing. You might say, perhaps we're doing all this retrospectively. But if you look on the internet, I've put up talks over the last 2 years saying 2017, I'm absolutely certain we will see dramatic events happen with Jerusalem because of the timings appear to be that. And lo and behold, there's the biggest shift in Jerusalem. Now, to start with, this is like a little pebble, isn't it, coming down the side of a hill. Trump's announcement doesn't look that massive, but we can see the anger, we can see the frustration. Do you realise that this week it's going to go to the Security Council, and the Palestinians are pushing it into the Security Council to annul President Trump's decision? America will veto it because they can, they're not going to go back on it, and then the whole thing moves into a new and much deeper crisis. The next chapter, of course, is Zechariah 14. So Zechariah 12 is about an initial inner ring conflict that is absolutely on the cards and could start any single day. But we then get to Zechariah 14 when all nations are gathered into this battle, and we read, I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses rifled, and the women ravished, and half the city will go forth into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city. This is saying to me, there's a great big war that ultimately is going to come upon this city. But of course, it doesn't end in horror and total destruction and failure and the world blowing itself apart. Though, if Jesus didn't intervene, that's exactly what would happen. But look at this, in the same chapter, Zechariah 14. It says, his feet, in the day when all the nations are fighting over Jerusalem, in that day his feet will stand upon the Mount of Olives. Now somebody tell me, whose feet do you think they might be that come down and touch down, if you like, on the Mount of Olives? Jesus' feet. It's Jesus himself who comes into the conflict at this point. But here's the amazing thing. He doesn't come on his own. It says in the next verse that all the saints are with him, which means the judgment has taken place before this. We've already been gathered to be with him before this. This has happened before. So we probably aren't going to see all of these things happen, because if we're on side with God and on side with Jesus now, we're taken to be with Jesus. Jesus could return at any single solitary time from here on in. And the chapter goes on and says that the Lord should be king over all the earth. In that day there'll be one Lord and his name one, and there'll be no more utter destruction. But look at this. Jerusalem shall be safely inhabited. The future of Jerusalem will finally be what Jerusalem's name means. What does Jerusalem mean? City of peace. It is not a city of peace now. There's violence raging in it every day since Trump's announcement. And it's going to get a whole lot worse. But when Christ comes, it will become a city of peace. In fact, and this is a very poor, I've put this together, it looks a bit daft, but it basically says in the Bible that Jerusalem is going to get lifted up like a great big mountain above all of the hills. And on top of it is going to be built the most wonderful temple to God. And it says that all people, there won't be many left actually, it says few men will be left after the terrible events that are coming on the earth, but the people that are left will come up to it to worship there. But rather than me say it in my words, this is how the Bible puts it. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's house will be the highest of all, the most important place on earth. It will be raised up above the other hills, and people from all over the world will stream there to worship. People from many nations will come and say, "Come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of Jacob's God. There he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For the Lord's teaching will go out from Zion, his word will go out from Jerusalem. The Lord will mediate between nations and will settle international disputes. They will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will no longer fight against nation, nor train to war anymore." And the remarkable thing is, those last few words, if you walked into the United Nations building, across the front door as you walk in, are the words that men will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, and men will not learn war anymore. And yet the very organisation that says those words is going to help bring about the utter and complete destruction that we've seen, and only the intervention of Christ will sort that out. Might be wrong on some of these dates, but look, if we're not on tiptoes while these things are happening, then when else should we be on our tiptoes? There is enormous events, I believe, that are going to happen, and the whole avalanche coming down the side of the hill, set off by President Trump, ultimately is going to lead to the return of the Lord Jesus Christ. There is no doubt that God has put that man into power to bring about the events that we're now seeing. Thank you for listening.